Dr. Van Vilet, how are you? Welcome. Thanks for coming here.
Thank you for having me, Sean. I'm excited.
Hey, I'm gonna let you give you a little background. I was just kind of skimming through some of your, your research publications. It's fascinating stuff. I'm super excited to look at. I'm going to be reading a lot of your papers. I've been looking at this stuff because it's stuff that, I think is particularly interesting. For you guys on YouTube coming over to MeatRx, you can check out the whole interview. I think Dr. Van Vilet has just got some tremendous research background on a number of topics. So I look forward to getting into this. But for those that aren't familiar with your work or familiar with you, can you give us a little, maybe 5-minute synopsis of your background, please?
Yes, absolutely. So I earned my PhD in kinesiology and community health as an Aspen Fellow at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. Then I received a few years of postdoctoral training at the Center for Human Nutrition in the School of Medicine at Washington University in St. Louis. And since the last 2 years, I've been in the Duke Molecular Physiology Institute, which is within the School of Medicine here at Duke University. And most of my research is performed on the nexus of agriculture and human health. I'm really interested in linking food production systems to human health and how we can increase the nutrient density of foods. And of particular relevance in my work is looking at the whole food matrix. As many of you know, we tend to take a very reductionist approach to nutrition, focusing on maybe protein or a few key vitamins and minerals and fatty acids. But foods in its natural state contain tens of thousands of unique compounds that are capable of impacting human health. And these are some of the things that I found in my earlier work, where we looked at things like some of the compounds that we find in whole eggs, and we compared those to egg whites, which is a very similar protein source in terms of amino acid compound. But if you sort of take away a lot of these nutrients, which we call secondary compounds, you actually see that you influence metabolism quite a bit. So after I started to join Duke, I also really got interested in what are some of these techniques that we can increase the nutrient density of foods. And obviously, the obvious way to do so is to increase, at least the way, start from the ground up, literally, and start to increase the nutrient density of soils, and link this to plants, and subsequently animal foods. So a lot of my recent work is focused on comparing the phytochemical richness of various animal foods, such as meat and milk, but also looking at what are some of these novel protein sources, like the plant-based proteins, and how do they compare to meat, for instance, since these are brought as nutritional replacements. And further, my studies have evaluated the effects of dietary patterns and several food sources on protein and lipid metabolism. I look at inflammation, insulin action, body composition, intracellular signaling pathways. So these are some of the things that our lab here in Duke focuses on.
When you were in Illinois, was Don Layman there? Did you train with him? Or I know he's from Illinois, but I don't know.
Yeah, no, he just retired when I joined the University of Illinois. I trained under Dr. Nicholas Bird there, and Don was a professor emeritus, so he came around in our lab from time to time because he studied protein metabolism, and my advisor at the time, Nick Bird, also studies protein metabolism. So yeah, I interacted with him quite a few times.
Yeah, I mean, I've had the pleasure of interviewing Don Layman a couple of times, Stu Phillips, Jose Antonio. A lot of guys have been in the protein field. But one of the things, and this is the thing that I'm super excited about, because much of that research, as you point out in your research, has been based on isolates. Whey protein isolates, casein protein isolates. And me personally, I don't eat a lot of isolates. I mean, I eat a lot of steak and eggs, and some dairy from time to time. And so we don't really have a great breadth of knowledge on how that really impacts muscle protein synthesis, inflammation, all those things that as an athlete, I'm interested to learn what the science is. I know what it does personally. I mean, I'm pretty pleased with what the results I've gotten with that. But before we talk about the food production stuff, I want to dig into how whole foods are different than isolates. The study, I think it was a 2017 paper where you showed that whole eggs are better than nitrogenous amounts of egg whites for muscle protein synthesis. So can you give us an overview of how, like fats are important? I know that when I talked to Stu Phillips, he said we know fats have a role. We just don't know what they do yet. But what is the advantage of a whole food? And the other thing that is difficult is, the absorption rates. When I go and eat, like when I'm going to go to breakfast, I'm going to probably have 200 grams of protein, a bunch of eggs, and a steak. That's going to absorb very differently than if I were to hit the same amount of whey protein. I'd never do 200 grams of whey protein in one shot. But let's talk a little bit of the physiology around food versus isolates, and then what's going on about the whole food components versus individual pieces. So I think that's fascinating. I've not heard a lot of people that have researched this, and you have.
Yeah, exactly. No, that was a major part of my work. I was like you also, I noticed that the literature was mostly based on isolates, mostly whey protein, casein, soy protein isolate. But I mean, this is not how we obtain our protein. We eat whole foods generally. And it does get complicated very quickly, Sean, when we talk about some of these things that are in there. If we, for instance, look at beef, it contains over 50,000 unique metabolites. But one of the things that we focused on initially is indeed looking at whole eggs versus egg whites. The typical thought is that the amino acid composition of a food source dictates the muscle protein synthetic response. And while this is certainly the key variable dictating that response, you do have some of these fatty acids, and we know this of cholesterol, for instance, that can impact protein synthesis. We know this of more well-known like DHA. There's been a lot of work done on that, on the essential fatty acids, that they can impact protein synthesis rates. And this is done through intercellular anabolic signaling. But we also know, and this is mostly from older work, is that several vitamins and minerals play key roles as intermediates in metabolism, including protein metabolism. So this could be several B vitamins, iron, zinc, retinol, vitamin A, etc. These play crucial roles. So while I really can't pinpoint it down and say this is, because people often ask me, like, what is it in the eggs or in the yolk that causes this heightened anabolic response versus when you would throw out the yolk in the egg? Then it gets complicated quickly, and it's probably the whole food matrix in itself that is interacting with all these nutrients interacting and getting that response. Because we know, for instance, from many other studies, that if we isolate a particular nutrient, we render it ineffective. Think of carotenoids and beta carotene. Think of even some of the fish oils, where we see very mixed results. Whereas with eating fish, getting into the whole food matrix is definitely important. And so the work that we did with our eggs, it was a follow-up really on some of the work that Kevin Tipton did, another big name in the protein metabolism field, that showed that when you consume skim milk versus whole milk, you actually get a higher muscle anabolic response after consuming whole milk. And at the time, that work was considered a little bit of an anomaly because it wasn't really clear why that was the case. And then we did that work with eggs 10 years later and found it again. And I think especially in the last few years, there's an increased realization that this matrix effect, these nutrients that are in the whole food source, that these impact metabolism and therefore can give you a higher muscle anabolic response at the same amount of protein.
Let me, Stephan, just before you go, because one of the I wouldn't say critiques, but one of the thoughts on it as well, it's just more calories because you're eating the egg yolk and it's got a lot more calories, and we know that calories are one of the things that stimulates protein synthesis. So were you able to isolate that it was not a caloric effect and it was some of the nutritional components within either the whole milk or the egg yolk?
In that particular study, we did match completely for protein, but we did not match for fat. So you could argue that perhaps the extra fat, the extra calories could have helped. But it is important to realize is that these participants came off after an overnight fast, and the only difference really was the fat component. So it was maybe a difference of about 100, 120 calories there. And we know that, I mean, simply eating more is not per se going to improve the anabolic response. There's been some work done out of the Netherlands, and also a lab where I trained before I came to the US, where you could use these isolates, like you mentioned, casein, isolated casein or isolated whey, and they added carbohydrates to that, also in an isolated form, such as in the form of dextrose, or they added fat to it as also an isolated fat form. And what you there see is that this did not increase the muscle anabolic response. So if you take these individual constituents and put them back together, then you don't get a heightened response. So I don't think it's just purely extra calories. It's definitely also the nutrients that are in there in the whole food matrix as well. What we sometimes refer to in our work as a matrix effect.
Yeah, and I've seen that before, the thought that, when looking at muscle protein synthesis, I think I talked with Stu Phillips on this, is, there's studies out there showing that whey protein isolate plus carbohydrate does not result in any greater muscle protein synthesis response than just protein alone. And so there's it seems like protein. Now, I was looking through one of your papers, and because leucine is considered the trigger, right? It's the mTOR trigger, but in some of your work, it says, well, maybe hold on, maybe not so fast. Maybe there's some other things going on there. Can you talk about whole protein versus leucine and how that? Because I just kind of glancing at that paper, I haven't had a chance to fully digest it. But what were you getting at with that paper?
Yeah, so I mean, we certainly know that leucine is a key anabolic trigger. And it probably will dictate largely the muscle anabolic response. But one of the important key things about it is also you need the full complement of protein, for the full complement of amino acids to build protein synthesis. So the focus on leucine, for instance, and this is the work that I did at WashU, what we showed was if you simply give someone leucine, you stimulate the muscle anabolic response, but you run out of substrate pretty quickly. It is like pushing the gas on your car. You can push the gas pedal, but if you don't have any fuel in your tank, you're not going to get very far. So that's what we showed in that paper, is that, yes, you use up the remaining amino acids that are available in the free pool within the muscle. So you can synthesize some protein, some new muscle protein, but you need to ingest the full complement of amino acids if you want to maintain that response. So that is why also I am personally not a huge fan of supplementing, for instance, with BCAAs only for that reason, and rather see that if people were to supplement, that they do indeed take a protein supplement like an isolate, but preferably try to eat all their food through whole food sources.
Yeah, that's something, and the part of the world that you're from, I think dairy, particularly Scandinavia, in the Netherlands. I don't know if it's considered Scandinavia or not.
No, we're just below it.
Yeah, I know, but there's a lot of dairy consumption, whole dairy consumption. You talk, and when I'm older and I've been lifting weights and training for years, and I go back to these big, giant, world's strongest man competitors, and they would always talk about this massive amounts of beef and dairy, and they're big, strong, huge people. And so, you just see that example. I don't know if that influenced you in any way about what you thought about research, but I know that's in the history there.
Yeah. No.
One of the things that there was so the absorption profile, like I said, you talked about whole food protein versus isolates. I think in one of your papers you showed that whey protein maybe peaks, the amino acidemia peaks at 60 minutes, whereas a whole food maybe 2 hours or more.
Yeah.
If I'm eating, and I don't even know what that dosage is on, I'm assuming it's probably an equivalent amount of whole food protein. Now, like I said, again, and I asked Don this question, hey, Don, I'm gonna eat 150 grams of protein for breakfast in the form of a steak and eggs. And he goes, well, we don't have any research on that. So to tell you what's going on, I know from GI physiology that the gastric motility, the GI physiology is going to slow down. It's going to slow down the transport of that. So I'm going to get this. My assumption is I'm going to get this prolonged lower steady state of amino acidemia. And I don't know how much leucine is going to be in there, but do we have anything that can say, hey, what's going on with that? When should we eat? Relative to exercise? I know the anabolic window is bigger than we thought it was, but do we have any data on that stuff yet?
It is very long. And one thing, for instance, to point out is that I think it's not important not to get those are very much details, Sean, like the absorption rate, because what we, for instance, showed that the yolk in the whole eggs group delayed digestion absorption. With egg whites, it peaked at about 60 to 90 minutes, whereas it was about 120 to 150 minutes after eating whole eggs. So the fat slows it down. Now, over that 5-hour window, the same amount of amino acids became available. So you sort of just shift the curve a little bit towards the later postprandial phase or the post-meal phase. But we still saw this higher response. So obviously, one of the things that's often noted is, okay, we need to take in whey protein because it spikes up these amino acids right after a workout, right? But what we show is even with the delay, and this was done after resistance exercise when we fed these people the whole eggs and the egg whites, we see this delay in digestion absorption, but they still get a higher muscle anabolic response. So I think the digestion absorption, we notice from other work too, that is really, as long as the total amino acids that become available over maybe a 5-hour window are similar, that you don't really see any of these differences as much, really. So yeah, I that's definitely not a major factor, I would say.
Yeah, because one of the, obviously the classic refrain we hear is, you've got for muscle protein synthesis, and I realize that a lot of the protein we absorb doesn't necessarily go to muscle protein synthesis. It goes to gut turnover and other organs are there and so on and so forth. But we hear this 30 grams, 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine every meal. According to Don Layman, mTOR can be tripped. The trigger is every 3 to 4 hours, perhaps. And so people will say, I'm going to eat every 3 or 4 hours as a bodybuilder. That's been a classic thing. And there's other people that are like, I don't want to spend all day lugging Tupperware around. And I just go back and thinking about from an evolutionary perspective, would we have been able to eat 30 gram protein boluses every 3 or 4 hours as a nomadic human? I think we would have died as a species had that been a requirement. So do we have it? Can we say, can I eat 200 grams of protein? I mean, I'm not losing all that protein, am I? I mean, I think I would die if that were the case, right?
No, you're right, Sean. And this is mostly based on these acute studies that show that, okay, we need these repeated bolus feedings. But if you then go to more of the long-term data where we maybe run an 8-week or 12-week study, you see that total protein is definitely king. That's the largest dictating factor. Your total intake during the day is going to override some of these nuances. So that is important to note, is that maybe in like the short, these acute data, we definitely see that you get these repeated stimulations. But then if we go to sort of a whole or a real world approach and look at this, like you said, then if you shift everything to like a certain meal or then definitely there may be some nuances there, but the overall amount that you consume during the day is definitely going to be by large the most dictating factor. And like you said, probably from an evolutionary standpoint, we'd kill something, ate for it for 4 days, and then maybe didn't eat very much animal source protein for several days after that. So
let me, because you talk about animal source versus plant source of protein, and you mentioned that if you combine things, beans and rice or so on, that's a classic combination. You can get there. I've seen recent studies that come out where I think they sort of equally parsed out the amino acid concentration, plant source versus animal source, and we got a greater amino acid response in the blood with the animal source. I think it was like a 40% difference or something like that. And my thought is, well, there's some things in plant foods that kind of interfere with the absorption of antitrypsins and stuff like that, or trypsin inhibitors rather, that do that. What is the difference between animal source and protein source food when it comes from whole food? I understand isolates are very different, but from whole foods, is there a significant difference in those two?
Yeah, I mean, again, there's not a whole lot of research. The animal versus plant protein research has mostly been done in response to isolates, like soy protein isolate or wheat protein. But it is interesting, the study that you mentioned indeed showed, because we hypothesized several years ago that the reason why, because you see an increase in splanchnic tissue protein synthesis with, so this is the liver and the gut, when you ingest plant proteins. And we thought that this was because of the unbalanced amino acid profile. You sort of send a signal to the liver or other essential organs saying like, hey, we're gonna, we have this unbalanced amino acid profile. Maybe we're running out of amino acids. We're gonna increase synthesis in these vital organs. That was sort of our hypothesis. But then a year ago, this work came out showing that if you give a sort of quote unquote complete plant protein source that is matched to the amino acids found in the animal proteins, that you still get this lower increase in the blood after eating. So I'm not 100% sure why that is, because that study was done at the backdrop of isolated proteins too. And as you mentioned, the anti-nutrients, which we call them, those were mostly removed out of the isolate. So I'm not 100% sure why that is the case. But one thing that I can tell you, and that has been shown now on several occasions, once you ingest enough protein, and we're talking maybe here about 1.5 grams per kg body weight, which would be about double then if you look at it or if you do it on pounds. I'm still in the metric because I'm from Europe, but you see that if you ingest enough, then this difference between animal and plant proteins becomes less important, and it probably is because you're ingesting so much amino acids that you're just saturating any potential differences.
Yeah, I think the challenge there is to get the same enough protein. It requires more calories and more food, and it may be difficult.
Yeah,
I think that's where the
and
issue is.
potentially you'd have to rely on these isolates when you do that. Although I'm sure that several people can eat that, especially if you look at a bodybuilder or something, but maybe not the average older individual that's in their 60s and is maybe living only on plant proteins.
Let's talk about protein needs. You like Stu Phillips and these other guys. I see some similar sort of maybe recommendations. Even up to, I think I saw up to 3 grams per kg in some situations, which is, I'm trying to think if I'm not. I don't even think I'm there right now. I'm a little under that, but that is, a lot of people would be horrified because they say, well, surely your kidneys are going to be damaged, your liver is going to be damaged. What are your thoughts on high protein damaging organs? What's the data on that?
In the absence of any pre-existing conditions, there's no evidence to suggest that is the case. So that is the simple and short answer on that. And that is regarding kidneys, regarding bones. In fact, you see that there's maybe some more resorption with protein. With higher protein diets actually increase bone health. So the short end of it is, and sometimes a little bit aggravating because these myths, they come around every so often, right? They're repeated and repeated, but there's just no strong evidence to suggest that. So.
Yeah, and there's probably good evidence to suggest that higher protein is probably have some benefits to us. I saw, with regard to protecting for sarcopenia and all these other issues, but I saw a couple nuances about age and then perhaps age and then like diabetes versus not diabetes in protein absorption and muscle synthesis. What are the nuances we know about that at this point?
Yeah, so, I mean, there's a little bit of concern. I think that's what you're getting after is that, especially a few years back, that was the idea is that maybe amino acids can cause diabetes or insulin resistance in that regard. But mostly what you see in these conditions is that you have impaired BCA catabolism. So that's why you see these increases in the fasted state. And sort of people have taken that and looked at that from the perspective, okay, well, we see these amino acids elevated with insulin resistance, and therefore maybe we want to limit protein intake. But if you look at it, especially from various dietary studies or weight loss studies, that higher protein intakes is going to protect you from muscle loss, it increases satiety, and it helps you lose weight easier. So from that perspective, I would say that higher protein diets, even in these cases, when the main thing is that you need to lose weight. Obviously, if you're for instance, have diabetes or obesity, obviously that's going to be the main factor. But I definitely think a high protein diet can benefit that. There's a lot of research to suggest that.
Yeah, I think it's the notion of the faulty causality of that BCAA, the branched chain amino acidemia you see with diabetes, and then people sort of conflate that to causative and what's happening. I guess is you're in a catabolic state, you're breaking down muscle, and that's why it's there. It's not the other way around.
And a lot of it that is shown in animal models, and also another thing we often see is that in animal models, for longevity, if you have the decreased mTOR stimulation by protein restriction, you increase longevity in animal models. But absolutely in humans, there's no reason to suggest that. I would argue that if you protein restrict at an older age, you just waste away slowly. So there's this congruence between animal data on one hand and then human data on the other hand, where it doesn't always shake out.
Yeah, I want to get into the current work you're doing. One more sort of question somebody's asking about there. Do you know if there's any solid evidence about, say low carb ketogenic diets changing protein requirements, i.e., or in other words, does a ketogenic diet, is it relatively protective from catabolism, or is it muscle sparing, so to speak, or is there any, can we say that with any sense of definitiveness? There
is some research that came out in the last few years suggesting that ketones are protein sparing, and from that perspective, that could be the case. And if you think of it from an evolutionary standpoint, that makes sense, right? If at what state we have a heightened ketone elevations in your blood if you're probably nearly starving. So what does your body do? It tones down the cellular processes so that you can focus on probably finding food to actually eat. And that's also why with a ketogenic diet, you see these increases in cognitive function, right? Because what do you need to do when you're in a highly ketogenic state? You need to be very sharp in your brain, and you need to tone down these cellular processes in your body so you can focus on getting more food. So you do see a decrease in catabolism with elevated ketones, but I also want to caution against seeing protein breakdown as something that's negative. It is very much an important part of our body that we break down all dysfunctional proteins and replace them with new ones. So there is maybe some caution to that, but I wouldn't say that's the case per se with a ketogenic diet, that there's any issue with protein cell death or something. I don't want to go far saying that, but there is some idea of a protein sparing effect.
Let's talk a little. Well, let's shift over and talk about your current stuff. So one of the things that I lament, as someone who promotes an animal-based diet, there is a complete dearth of, animal nutrition, as it applies to human outcomes. I looked at a Texas A&M study from, several years back where they looked at grass finished versus grain finished on lipid markers. Really insignificant difference. There's a study out of Australia looking at kangaroos versus cows, which isn't even the same species.
No.
What, so I'm like, how useful is that? And then they're looking at, postprandial inflammation. What does that mean? I get inflamed after I exercise. So is there any shift? I mean, I know it's probably tough to get funding for this, perhaps, maybe, I don't know, but what are we starting to see? Like, hey, if an animal is pastured a certain way and we've got quote unquote healthy animals versus diabetic or sick animals, does it make a definitive change in human diets? Because I know there's a lot of studies out there comparing this animal has this X, Y, and Z component in its meat versus this one that has a little less, a little more. But we don't have the human data on that yet, or at least I haven't seen it. Where are we at in that regard? What's the state?
You're absolutely right, Sean. There's 30 years of data suggesting that animals raised on pasture, when they eat a very diverse diet, and we can go into some of these phytonutrients that are found in there, but you see that the nutritional profile definitely looks a lot healthier in pasture-raised animals, and especially if you go beyond maybe looking at the essential fatty acids or some vitamins and minerals, especially if you look at phytonutrients like terpenoids and phenolic compounds, carotenoids, tocopherols. You definitely see a big advantage for grass-fed meat and milk. But then there's been surprisingly little work done in humans actually studying that. And you mentioned the kangaroo study that showed a dampened inflammatory response after eating kangaroo, but the beef was fatter and it was a different animal, so that's conflated. Then you have some work on milk, or I should say cheese from sheep raised in mountain pastures versus sheep or cheese from sheep that were more finished on grains. And you do see also an inflammatory response there that is lower with the pasture-raised cheese. And this was a longer-term study, but then if you indeed look at the Texas A&M study that looked at grass-fed meat versus grain-fed meat, showed no difference. But these are also important things to realize, is that in that study, it was 5 or 4 patties, I think, that they consumed a week. And the beef was perhaps maybe not as phytochemically rich because it was mostly raised on a monoculture grass, which has a different phytochemical complexity than maybe someone like Glenn Elzinga that you had on your show, and Gabe Brown, whose animals may consume 70, 80, or even 150 different plant species. So there may be some nuances in that. And then the other point, of course, is that, and this is again coming back to the sort of the reductionist approach that we have to nutrition. If you consume 2 wholesome diets and the only thing that you switch out is maybe a beef patty for grass or grain fat 4 times a week, I mean, your overall diet is going to have a much greater impact on that, right? So maybe when we start looking at, if let's say you consume your eggs, you consume your pork, you consume your dairy, you consume your meat, all from different sources, then maybe we can see a difference. But at the moment we don't know that. But for instance, in your case or in the carnivore community, that's really where maybe we could see some of these differences, or in a more of an omnivorous perspective where we look at all the animal food sources, or even taking it even one step further and looking at even plant foods from sort of more of a regenerative system. So as you rightfully point out, now there is not a lot of data in humans to suggest that. So we started up some of that work recently, started a randomized controlled trial, a human trial. Unfortunately, I don't have much data to share yet, because we just started with 3 participants. But essentially what we're doing is we're replicating that kangaroo study, this time with beef, grain fat versus grass fat beef. And we're also, the third arm is going to be a novel plant-based patty. And we match those for fat, and then going to see if there's a difference. And we're also taking a metabolomics approach where we run metabolomics on the food sources. And metabolomics is a technique that allows the researchers to really go deep into all the nutrients that are in the food source, and they give you thousands of compounds that are in there. So we will look at those in the foods, then we will feed people the different types of meat, and then we're going to take blood, and then we're going to look at those metabolomes in the meat on one hand, and the plasma of the consumers on one hand, and then sort of overlay the two to see if there's at least some of these compounds, are they becoming available, or they start changing the metabolome initially, and then of course we can extend that to longer term studies. But yeah, I mean, the short end of it is that there's a handful of human nutrition studies done on this now, and we definitely cannot say with any confidence at the moment that we can link these animal production systems to human health.
Yeah, I mean, and like I said, I don't know where your research is going to go, but I can tell you, within our community of people, that as crazy as some of it may seem, we've got people that are just eating meat. So I think that would be an ideal, in my mind, that would be the least dietary confounded study you could do with this stuff. And so hopefully some people will say, hey, let's get 10 of these carnivore people and run 10 this way and 10 that way.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is the outcomes. What are you assessing? I mean, if you say, well, their carotenoid level went up in their serum,
yeah,
mean anything? And so I'm more interested, does it mean they're not as likely to become diabetic? Are they able to get off meds? Are they healthier? Is their body composition? So hopefully we get to a point where we can have clinically meaningful outcomes at the same time. And I know that's a big ask, and it's probably
it will be multi-year study probably, right? So we have to rely on some of these short-term outcomes to an extent, like looking at inflammation or looking at lipoprotein profiles, right? If we really
I think, depending on what you're looking at, but like if you look at, say, diabetes, I mean, we see we can improve glycemia very rapidly in a diabetic. So you could take someone with a high hemoglobin A1C for 3 months, you could run them on grass finished beef, very diverse pasture versus whatever you beef from your local grocery store that's on a monocrop. And you could probably get a reduction in hemoglobin A1C, and you might see a significant difference between the two. So perhaps, I'm just kind of throwing some thoughts out there that I've had over time. And I've had, like I said, we've had Glenn out there, and it's interesting. What is the, so I guess, do you look much, fat, I guess, because, in the absence of carbohydrates, I think fat becomes, just from an energy source, becomes more important. Is there any, and not all fat is the same, which is, I think, one of the problems. Not even all saturated fat. And we hear saturated fat and unsaturated fat. And I mean, even within the saturated fat, there's so many varieties of saturated fat. Is there anything you can speak to regarding, because dairy has a lot of saturated fat relative even to beef. Beef is more monounsaturated fat. Most people don't realize that. What are the different roles of different fats, or have you been able to look into that?
Yeah, so I mean, the fat component is definitely important, and a lot of the nutrients that I'm talking about in our work too are fat soluble, so such as terpenoids or carotenoids, as you mentioned. So I mean, it definitely is more complicated than unsaturated fat is good for you and saturated fat is bad for you, irrespective of the source. I mean, we know this from lots of work, and even some of the epidemiological work that is often critiqued shows that people that eat more whole fat dairy, right, have maybe lower risk factors, and we can sort of see that happening also in in more mechanistic work, whereas maybe some of these fat-soluble compounds have anti-diabetic effects or even anti-carcinogenic effects, etc. So just simply thinking of this reductionist approach, indeed, that saturated fat is bad, it doesn't hold up. And then we can see also that the main fatty acid in beef, for instance, stearic acid, as if you actually look at that in population studies and even start to tease some of those things out, that you can see that there's there's definitely differential responses in there. So I definitely think that from a whole food perspective, when consumed as part of whole food sources, saturated fat, that you generally see do not see these negative health effects as much, for sure. Yeah, and in fact, give you various positive benefits.
We hear, I hear a lot of people that when they're critical of people on this diet, they'll say, well, you're not getting phytonutrients, and I'm like, I don't know that they're essential. But let's say we're eating animals, and animals tend to bioconcentrate. So how much is a role, and how much availability do I get from eating an animal that has bioconcentrated phytonutrients that they've ingested? Do I access that? How does that compare to getting it directly from the plant? Because a lot of people say, well, just eat the plant. I'm like, well, the animal concentrates it for me, and I prefer anyway. That's
I think a lot of people definitely underestimate that, where people think of phytochemicals as purely present in the plant kingdom. And that's one of our upcoming papers that we talk about heavily, is that the phytonutrients, you do get some considerable amounts in there. So even some of your community members might unwittingly still get a bunch of phytonutrients in their body by eating plant foods. I certainly want to say that indeed there's some nuance to look at. Pasture-raised animal foods contain the highest amounts of phytonutrients compared to and especially if it's botanically diverse. So an animal that consumes 50 different plants on pasture is going to have much more phytonutrients than an animal that's on a monoculture grass, maybe consuming 2-3 different types of grasses. And then the lowest in phytonutrients, and often absent in several phytonutrients, are the grain fat varieties. So, and this has been mostly underestimated and virtually unheard of in these discussions that have myopically focused on omega-3 fats and maybe conjugated linoleic acid. But it's really there in these phytonutrients, terpenoids, polyphenols, tocopherols, carotenoids, where you see these major differences. And it might be 5 to 20-fold higher in diverse pasture-raised animal foods that have been reared on diverse pastures. So you do get substantial amounts in. I cannot speak at the moment to the bioavailability. This has not been compared properly, whether you get more of these if the bioavailability is higher. So let's say if you get your chlorogenic acid from milk versus maybe a plant food, coffee or tea, if that makes a difference. That is not known at the moment. But what I can tell you is that, for instance, some of these compounds, they are in substantial amounts and sometimes even comparable to those in plant foods. So while plant foods contain on average 5 to maybe 20-fold higher, we should not ignore the contribution of phytonutrients to the diet from animal foods, and they add to the overall intake. And another very important thing to note is that animals consume grasses and forbs and shrubs that you and I have no access to otherwise, right? So there's no way we could consume those. So we are potentially getting, and it's also a little black box at the moment, but you definitely see some of these, what we think of as unusual compounds that are maybe found in certain trees and in certain forbs that we do not expect to see in foods, but they are appearing in animal food. So that could be a way that we can access these nutrients that we would otherwise not have access to. And I think that is a very important part, and probably speaks in the favor of why getting phytonutrients from animal foods can be potentially complementary to receiving those from plant foods.
Yeah, I mean, just given the relative dearth of anti-nutrients in animal food, my just gut guess would be the absorption profile would be reasonably good. I mean, that would be my thought, but I mean, that's obviously needs to be proven, I suppose.
That's my gut feeling too. Yes. But
I want to talk. Maybe milk is kind of or dairy is kind of a controversial topic. Some people in general, there's a lot of people that don't like dairy. They think it's got these, casomorphins that are addictive, and it's inflammatory, and it causes type 1 diabetes in Scandinavian. There's associational data.
Yeah.
We got a lot of type 1 diabetics in Scandinavia. They drink a lot of milk, and there's different people that will talk about different types of dairy, what animal it comes from, whether it's sheep, whether it's an A1 or an A2, or whether it's pasteurized or homogenized versus raw dairy. Is there any guiding stuff out there on dairy that we could talk about that you could lend some more nuance to, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it, and I also come from a country where dairy consumption is very high. We as the Dutch love our cheeses and our milk, and I always still consume them to this day. But I think a lot of it also has to do with maybe you see some of these inflammatory responses. You could see this, but if you, for instance, look at more of these traditional processing techniques where we look at like yogurt or kefir or cheese that have been fermented, you can definitely see some of these differences there. I think with whether you can handle this, can handle milk or not. So these are potentially some of these important nuances where fermented dairy, some of these associations that you talk about, they generally do not shake out with fermented dairy. So that is also an important thing to look at in the future, whether this will modulate your response. And of course, if you're certain sensitivities or an intolerance, then yeah, you're going to generate a huge inflammatory response if you were to consume milk. But yeah, generally in populations that have traditionally consumed milk or fermented dairy foods, you do not always see some of these issues. So I definitely think there's nuances. And like you said, Shawn, I mean, if we're homogenizing milk, we're using modern industrial techniques. That is something maybe that we haven't done in the past. So and we do know that there's several mutagens and several perhaps inflammatory or carcinogenic compounds that can form then. So it's the same really with if you were to with heat treatment of other foods, and even with meat sometimes. I mean, if you eat all your meat grilled, maybe, or burned or charred, then yeah, you see some of these compounds forming. But so there are important nuances to that.
I see with a lot of dairy products, there's different thickeners, there's carrageenan, and there's different monodiglyceride added, and different things that you just wonder, I mean, obviously it's for shelf stability and consistency and probably consumer preference, but do those have an impact beyond the normal dairy? And I suspect they probably do. Yeah,
there is some research to suggest that you alter your microbiome with things like carrageenan and that maybe are not as positive, or if insofar you can say that about a microbiome profile. But yeah, there's definitely some suggestions that some of these things are problematic. And it's the same, for instance, if you look at processed meats, there's a heavy association with processed meats. Well, is it the meats themselves, or is it the nitrate curing, whereas maybe in the past we did more of a slow salt curing where we have a slower fermentation process. Also there, I mean, still a bit of a black box, but there's also work to suggest that there maybe some of these negative effects that are associated with processed meat. It matters how you process the meat. If you use more traditional techniques, then maybe you do not always see these issues. So a lot of shortcuts, I would say, to modern industrial processing that are convenient, but maybe not always the best for our health.
Yeah, I interviewed a guy named Bill Schindler who's big into, I don't know if you're familiar with Bill, but he's an anthropologist. He goes and hangs out with these indigenous tribes, and he learns how they're traditionally processing foods, and that's how he eats. And, he eats an omnivorous diet. So he's fermenting all his vegetables, and he's killing his own animals, and he's making his dairy a certain way, and so on and so forth. And, I think he's a big proponent of that. And I think,
it's definitely with some things like technological advancement has been, very important and helpful for us as humanity, but sometimes with food, I cannot help to think that we've gone backwards. So,
well, yeah, no, obviously, I mean, the fact that you and I are having a conversation with 50 other people watching is a huge technology leap, and that certainly is a positive thing. But so let's, so as you see what's being laid out there, what's coming out of Silicon Valley, what's coming out as far as the future of food. I don't know, Bill Gates, maybe Bill Gates is talking about food as software.
Yeah.
We're going to be able to 3D print food. You're going to use novel ingredients to mimic taste sensations and texture sensations. Do you have any concerns about that?
Yeah, I mean, it overestimates our knowledge of food, which is very little. We maybe have a few percent understanding of that. So, and it's again based on this reductionist approach that we can think that we can just throw together a few isolated proteins, some vitamins and minerals, and maybe some other novel ingredients, and then can say like, hey, we recreated meat. That's obviously it's kind of arrogant, I would say, and concerning in the sense that it grossly overestimates our knowledge of food, and I must say I don't want to claim that I have any, even I would say that we're scratching the surface and that I have a very limited knowledge of what is in these eggs or what is in meat. Like I said, I mean, right now, for instance, beef has an estimated unique 55,000 unique metabolites in there. We're only scratching the surface of barely understanding what is in there and some of the health effects that they have. And then to think that you can recreate that by using a few isolated ingredients is obviously, not the case. That's going to be very, very, very complicated and concerning. It's sort of a Band-Aid approach, I think.
Yeah, I think that is extremely possible. To say that beef has 50,000+ individual molecules or potential nutrients that we consume, and they're going to string together 30 or 40 of them, and say, hey, this is meat, is, like you said, I think it's grossly underestimated. And probably of those 55,000 compounds, we've probably studied not even 1% of them as to the impact.
Yeah, exactly. No, like I said, that's a sort of based on a lot of other metabolomics data too. But I mean, when I run them through our mass spec, maybe there's several, the majority of which we cannot even annotate. We see that there's compounds there, but have no idea what they are. So we're definitely scratching the surface, and it becomes very complicated very quickly. And one of the studies that we did, I was interested in that just sort of purely from also a personal standpoint, because these novel plant proteins came out, and of course, I mean, they'll have a future. They will definitely be in our shelves, and the same with plant-based milks. I mean, they occupy maybe like 10% of the market right now, and I'm sure at some point it will be the same with these plant-based alternatives. But I was interested in taking a popular one and looking at it because it has the same nutrition label, at least the nutrient facts panel, as meat. So I ran them through our mass spec and then found that they're in fact 90% different if you sort of peel back the onion layer, right? So to say then that, and a lot of it is also what we call the secondary nutrients, but then to say that, it is replicated, no, it's 90% different. So our conclusion was to that paper, and hopefully it will come out next year. There's a preprint available online right now of that paper, is that they're not nutritionally interchangeable. They're very much different. So.
Yeah, and I think I looked at that preprint and I saw you had a graph like it was red and green, and it was, if I'm not mistaken, where it was like, it was like, meat is all red and plants are still green, and the compounds don't even. There's just a tiny overlap of what you're actually getting, so they're very different. Yeah,
foods. It was interesting. We had quite a chuckle here also with my colleagues in the metabolomics score when we saw that, because normally when we run metabolomics on something, there's quite a bit of overlap, but this was literally day and night. You don't even have to have any expertise of metabolomics to see that these are completely different. Indeed, it was literally just like beef was on one side, and then the plant alternative was on the other side. But it is important because there was a market research that came out about a year ago that showed that if you present people with these nutrient facts panels, that almost half the respondents thought that these are nutritionally interchangeable. You can eat beef, or you can eat a plant-based alternative matched to the beef, and you get similar nutrients. Yes, if you look at maybe 10, 15 nutrients that appear on a nutrition facts panel, you can get that idea. But then if you actually look beyond that and look behind the curtain, then there's these huge differences. So that's also really sometimes a problem with our reductionist approach to nutrition. I think we need to start to appreciate this phytochemical complexity of foods more, and this biochemical complexity and foods in their whole food matrix. And I know this is maybe difficult to put in like a like a food guideline or anything like that. That's usually heavily focused on some of these key nutrients. But I think in nutrition research, that's a huge issue. We need to move away from looking at these single nutrients and these single foods and associating that with health, where we need to look at these dietary patterns and also appreciate whole foods for what they are. They're very complicated. We don't know maybe a lot about them yet, but we should definitely look at a food first approach when it comes to these things. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just envisioning a nutrition label that was actually comprehensive. It would take you, a week to read it on every label or something. So you couldn't have. So you have this very scratch the surface, basic representation that doesn't tell anywhere near the whole story at all on that stuff.
No, but it is important that we recognize that in our communication towards consumers. I think that we recognize that.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess you could have, even if you use the things that we have sort of RDAs on, and so we don't have RDAs on the 54,185 chemicals in beef, right? We don't know what that is, and so exactly, the ones you have, you might even you could even say, the bioavailability and the relative effective amounts of these things. So I don't even think that's done, because when we look at like for instance, zinc availability in a legume is going to be much lower than it is in meat, even though they might give you the same number on the label, but we know that the
exactly. Bioavailability matters. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so those are some of these things that we need to look at in the future. But it's definitely very interesting to look at some of these plant components. For instance, if we look at, and initially I was also surprised to see that. So we run some metabolomics on Glenn's beef, which is probably the most phytochemically rich beef you can get, because his animals consume about 150 different plants, and that's also the comparison to the plant meat in that study that is coming out. But if you look at some of these things that are in there, like terpenoids or something like that, for instance, all known natural products, 60% of those are terpenoids, and those are essentially fat-soluble plant nutrients, lots found in essential oils. We know, like squalene, alpha-pinene, beta-pinene, and the list goes on and on and on, that these are very important, and they have anti-inflammatory effects, antioxidant effects, anti-diabetic effects, anti-carcinogenic effects. And it's going to be very hard, obviously, to study these health effects. But one thing important to note is that if we microdose these over a lifetime, right, that's where we can maybe see some of these effects. And for instance, interesting work that came out recently showed that grain-fed milk versus milk that was more antioxidant rich, by supplementing the animals with phytochemically rich feed. And this was an in vitro study, but then it decreased the viability of cancer cells, so the proliferation of cancer cells with the different types of milk. So again, very hard to prove that in humans, but there's definitely something mechanistically going on. And it is important to note that's where some of these differences may occur.
With regard to animals, I mean, obviously milk and eggs are going to be their own situation, but a whole animal, you've got different parts of the animal. Yeah. We've got organs, we've got marrow, we've got the fat versus the lean tissue. Do you see dramatic, like, isolated parts where you can only get this nutrient in this?
Yeah.
Or is it kind of more distributed a little bit across the board?
No, it's definitely interesting you bring up the organs, because it's definitely gotten more popular over time, organ meat, and people are coming back to it. But for instance, if you look at, let's do the comparison of grass-fed versus grain-fed meat. If you look at the muscle, the differences are not that big. They're maybe twofold higher in grass-fed meat. But if you look at the liver of the animal, you can find about 80 milligrams of DHA in 100 grams of beef liver, which is a very high amount, and almost starts rivaling some of the fish from the marine sources of DHA. So there's definitely large differences there, and you might actually see a 20-fold higher amount of these essential fatty acids. And what we also know from studies that measure the antioxidant capacity of different types of meat, we can definitely see that also in the liver of animals, the antioxidant capacity is much higher than muscle meat, about twofold higher, and maybe comparable to some of the antioxidant capacity that we see in plant foods. So you can definitely see some of these nuances there where we look at organ meat, that these tend to be more nutrient dense, and definitely that's going to be a follow-up to our work in muscle meat. Right now we're doing it in muscle meat because that's what people generally consume. But I definitely think once we start going to the organs and start comparing those and the metabolome profiles, I think that's where the difference might be even more dramatic.
Yeah, I don't doubt that at all, and maybe even the fat. I mean, you've looked at probably fat a little bit, but
yeah, we look at because most of these compounds are fat soluble. They're fat soluble in the plant, like terpenoids, for instance, but they're also indeed then fat soluble in the animal. So,
okay, and we've got a question asking about what does your personal diet look like? If you're willing to share that, you're not a vegetarian, I'm assuming. What do you typically?
No, my diet is omnivorous, rich in both plant and animal foods. But I mean, a lot of the things that I research, I must admit, I'm doing this also for sort of personal favor, and if it benefits other people, I'm happy about that too. But yeah, my diet, for instance, in the morning, I generally consume some eggs with some liverwurst or some bacon. And then I usually have some peppers or onions on the side and some fruits. For lunch, also some meat or some fish with some vegetables. At night also. So I tend to eat three times a day. I also lift weights, so my protein intake is probably a little bit higher, about double my body weight. But yeah, a lot of the things that I'm studying here also, of course, I mean, I try to take that in and also look at some of these things and implement them in my diet and my family's diet too. And I do eat my eggs cooked, because if you eat them raw, you only the bioavailability is about 50%.
Yeah, I've seen some, interactions between the egg whites, with the avidin and the biotin and some of those things. And I know there's been different studies on that. What about, and there seems to be a mixed data on cooking meat versus raw meat, because there's some people that look at just to meat raw. And I've seen sort of, there was a study on pigs recently eating ribeye steaks. I don't know if you saw that, but they looked at, because pigs are often used as a good model.
Yeah, that's right.
It was kind of interesting, and it wasn't necessarily that raw meat was better than cooked meat for absorption of nutrients in pigs. So I thought that's interesting.
Cooked good. Yeah, cooked definitely oftentimes makes it more bioavailable, and that's also some of at least the evolutionary theory, right? Like we first evolved when we had access to marine foods and meat, but then when we had access to fire, we saw there's another huge jump in our brain size because of the cooking hypothesis. So it definitely makes things oftentimes more bioavailable, and you even see that sometimes in animal data. I'm thinking of a study I read a few years ago, where if you feed a python cooked meat versus uncooked meat, that then even in a python, a snake, you see a difference in digestion absorption, maybe at the benefit of eating it cooked. So.
It's interesting. I've got two dogs, and one of them doesn't care, but one of them wants it cooked, and it's kind of a pain. So we just end up cooking it all for them.
Yeah, we have cats that I feed a raw diet, but I always tell them once you figure out how to cook it yourself, then you can eat cooked meat. But if they don't know how to cook it themselves, then they probably haven't been evolved to eat it.
That's true. I see a lot of that. What you mentioned bacon as part of the diet. Do you have any concerns about non-ruminant versus ruminant animals? Obviously, there's a difference in the way they absorb nutrients. What are your thoughts on?
I think. Well, I think definitely if we look at it from some of our work that we do, I would definitely expect to see in monogastrics. Especially because of the way they're raised, right? Like they might be their entire lives in more of a feeding operation type of deal, where cattle still spends the majority of their time out on grass. So they accumulate a lot of phytochemicals maybe in early stages, and you see the slowly decrease. That's what you see when they go into the feedlot. But with monogastrics, I think you might even see some of these differences even more pronounced that we talked about the phytonutrients versus a pig that is maybe raised out on pasture versus a pig that spends his entire life in a feeding operation. So I think you may see some of these difference there, and also accumulation of phytonutrients, or maybe some of the deleterious compounds. But also coming back to your question about bacon, and again, personally, I eat bacon that is cured traditionally by a local farmer that does these that doesn't use nitrate curing and does use a salt curing and for that reason, because again, I think a lot of these associations, and it's supported by the literature, obviously, because it's not just like me making this up, but the associations do differ. It does matter how you process it, even with processed meat.
Yeah, and I want to, Stephan, it's been an hour and this has been wonderful. I mean, I guess we would say eat a whole food, maybe instead of an isolate if you can. I mean, there's some, maybe some advantages for isolates if you can't get enough protein in for whatever reason. And then we're hopefully to be continued. We'll find out if these different techniques are. I'd love to have you come back in after that. Maybe if you've got more of that research done on your study, because that would be really fast. It's very fascinating to me. I want to know the answer because I don't know, and the research doesn't point us one way or the other.
No, it is very interesting. And I do want to say is that meat and milk, irrespective of how it was raised, provides many essential nutrients. But what I generally tell people is that if you can afford it, then I would definitely let your the power of the dollar and try to buy pasture-raised meats, right? Because they may be better for animal welfare too, maybe better for our environment. So if you can afford it, definitely buy pasture-raised. But it's not. I don't want to create the suggestion that grain fat or counterparts are that you should not eat those either. So I think that's the main thing, because they do provide a plethora of essential nutrients. And they contribute strongly to nutrient adequacy. I've
got a very similar philosophy on that, and until proven, like I said, I'd love to stand up there with the research and say, a regenerative raised animal is going to give you 15% greater reduction in diabetes. I'd love to be able to say that, but until the research is out there to show that, I'm not willing to sort of make that leap.
Yeah, and it's still that would even maybe be a very, I keep a very open mind, but that might even be like a big reduction, obviously. So I do think that some of these details are important, but ultimately I think you shouldn't lose sight of the bigger picture either. So,
all right, well, I'm getting hungry.
Yeah,
I haven't eaten breakfast yet. Hey, where can people go to find out more about you, about your research, or anything else you'd like to let people know?
Oh yes, absolutely. My Twitter handle is probably best. It's at Van Vliet, PhD. So that's how my last name is spelled, VANVLIET. Also, if you just Google my name, Stephan Van Vilet, PhD, you'll find it. You can also find my Google Scholar profile. We always try to make all our papers open access, because another pet peeve of mine is that one thing I hate about science, or at least that part, is that a lot of these papers are behind the paywall. So it should be free public access, right?
Yeah, there's a place called Sci-Hub that kind of helps with that a little bit, but
we gotta advertise that but yes, it is important that people have access to that. So I try to every time we have something come out, post it on Twitter with a little summary of our main findings, and where possible, I always try to pay open access for it. So yeah, just Google my name, you'll find my Google Scholar profile, you'll find my Twitter profile. And I'll definitely keep everyone posted there about the research, and as this comes out in the next few years, because as you mentioned, it's definitely right now we're heavily relying on philanthropy, where we work with some foundations that have interest in conservation and some of these like better meat and how does this impact the soil. So one of the future things that we'll look at is definitely make this connection, because you hear it all the time, right? Greater soil health. Healthier animals, healthier humans, but at the moment there's just not a whole lot of research to suggest that, even though intuitively it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, hopefully that research gets done, and hopefully people will support you. And I'm certainly excited to hear this. And if anything I can do to help, I'm certainly there for that. But anyway, thank you so much. Yeah, I'd love to have you. I'd love to come chat with you down the road a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, we have more data. I'll definitely come back and we'll talk about that in great detail. And in the next year, we have very interesting stuff coming out where we will compare. I think we'll also compare it to a wild ruminant. Try to compare it to maybe deer. See if we can see some of these the gold standard as in what if a wild animal. What does that accumulate in terms of phytonutrients, and can we replicate that in more of a livestock where we raise the animals ourselves? So those are very interesting things, and I also try to keep my eyes, at least keep an open mind on some of these novel plant-based alternatives, because they're inevitable. So anything we could even do, and I know your community won't consume them, but anything we can do to improve those at least, and at least make people aware of what is in them, and if they can represent adequate replacements.
Well, excellent. This has been wonderful and truly informative. And I'm going to be looking through some of your studies here in the near future. So I love to see what was in there. I was just a lot of questions I had. I looked at, if there's some studies and answer that. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks everybody for being here. We'll see you guys back tomorrow. Stephan, have a great rest of your weekend and look forward to hearing from you again.
Yes. Thanks again for having me, Shawn. It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.